Hello, this is Alan, and I recorded this video to discuss some of the EA coding specifications. So this video is directed to Too the coder, or Tauloin in French. um, but anybody watching this video could definitely gain some insight, as the coding specifications that we're discussing are based on the rules of the three keys system. So this is a three keys EA coding discussion. We're going to be going over some trades that we took in the month of July. So July 2024. I wanted to discuss was the temporality, right? I believe that a 2-week look back is gauging the timing of when the levels are actually hit. Okay. So this is the weekly middle pivot. So we know that this particular week is the current week, right? Okay, so this is a trade that I took on pound USD. It was a short, so it was taken on July 18th, so Thursday of this week, this current week. Okay, so we know that the previous week is this week right here, where this weekly middle pivot is. So this is the previous week, and this is the current week. So obviously, the main levels that are in question when taking the trade um, are based on the first rule, which is going to be these two levels. It's going to be the yearly midpoint pivot, or any yearly pivot level, really. Okay, so for shorts, let's say it's going to be any yearly resistance pivot, right? In this case, it's the yearly midpoint pivot right here, and any monthly resistance pivot above the monthly R1, right? Okay, so obviously the first rule is going to be uh, the daily S1 plots above the monthly R1, right? So the alert that we get for the scanner, um, the first version of the scanner anyway, would be right here. Okay. So then in this previous week, that's when price moved up and hit the yearly M3. But it wasn't until the uh, current week that price hit this monthly midpoint level, which is the monthly M5. Okay. And that's where we actually took the trade here. Okay. Because price moved up here, it didn't quite break below this midpoint, this daily middle pivot, right? And then price was under this daily pivot, but it didn't hit the the daily R1, and it didn't hit the weekly R1. So none of these trades satisfied the three keys rules. It wasn't until this current week that price moved up and then hit this monthly M5, right? This monthly midpoint pivot, and then came close to the weekly R1. That's when I look to take the trade, breaks below, and then I enter. And then we get a nice drop from there. Okay. And then obviously the initial target was the daily S1. Price dropped down from there. Okay. Now, so these two levels are the ones that are in question for this trade, right? Okay, because these are the ones that are hit. Okay, so this yearly midpoint pivot, the YM3, was hit in this previous week, and then in this current week, this monthly midpoint pivot was hit. Okay, so I would consider a 2-week look back for these levels to be hit. Okay, since this level was hit in the previous week, and this level was hit in the current week. I think a 2-week look back is the appropriate measure of the timing of when these monthly levels and yearly levels are hit. Okay, I don't think that looking back 3 weeks and seeing a level hit would be the appropriate measure. I think that the best measure would be, the most efficient measure anyway, I think would be a 2-week look back. Maybe if it within the EA, maybe to allow a degree of flexibility, if you can make it optional to select the time frame. So, or not the time frame, but say the amount of weeks, right? So maybe 1 week look back, or 2 week look back, or a 3 week or 4 week look back. So that way we can sort of have that customization built within the EA. Another thing that I wanted to mention was we were talking about how were we going to go about coding the rule that says close to the WR1, right? So in this particular short trade, this is the WR1 right here. Price came close to it. And I mentioned that potentially we could use the midpoint level, right? The weekly midpoint level as sort of a gauge. So say prices has hit that midpoint level, maybe that could be considered close to. But I feel as though that's not enough because sometimes um, I feel like that's still not close enough to the weekly R1. But I was speaking with a friend of mine who's also a trader, and what he recommended was if we could take a percentage of the distance between the weekly R1 and the weekly middle pivot, right? I would say close to weekly R1 can be 77% of the distance between the WR1 and the weekly middle pivot, right? So, for example, uh, this price level of the weekly middle pivot is 1.2918. The weekly R1 is 1.3059. So the pip distance between these two is, say, 140 pips, right? So that's 140 pips. And let's say 140 times 77% would be 107.8 pips. So from this distance here, from this level here, from this level of 1.2918, if we move to 107.6 or 0.8, I'm sorry, 107.8, which is basically around here. So around this level, once price hits this level, which is basically 77% of the pip distance between the weekly middle pivot and the weekly R1, we can consider that as close to the weekly R1. So from a coder's perspective, is it possible to code a level that is 80% of the distance between the weekly middle pivot and the weekly R1? If it is possible, we should use that as the rule for close to the weekly R1. So close to the weekly R1 means 77% of the pip distance between the weekly middle pivot and the weekly R1. Okay. And then obviously for longs, it would be, 77% of the distance between the weekly middle pivot and the weekly S1. Right. And I think that that's a good measure of close to the weekly R1. Obviously, you can see that price had gone way above that to 126.4. So I felt confident in taking this trade, and it's continuing to go down even in the month of August. Unfortunately, price, I dragged my stop, and then price got me out right around here. So that's okay. I'm also in a pound HKD, which had a similar setup. So yeah, that's that. Another thing that I wanted to discuss, other things, we'll do that for, okay, is the proximity of yearly and monthly pivots. I feel like it should not be more than 1.3 times the ADR apart. So if you look at this yearly level that's hit at this level, at this time, so price at this time hits the YM3, okay? And then it goes on to move and hit the monthly midpoint pivot, the monthly M5. So from a trader's perspective, if we're looking at the perception of the trader, they're looking to be influenced by, their perception is looking to be influenced by these interpretations, but these interpretations need to be in proximity to each other. We can't have, for instance, the yearly pivot hit here, and then the monthly pivot that's hit is, 200 pips further up. So now you have these levels are 200 pips apart. That is not enough proximity, right? Because we want these levels to be somewhat close to each other so that they can be perceived together, so that these levels can be interpreted at the same time when taking the trade, if you understand, right? So for example, if this is the monthly middle pivot here, I'm sorry, if this is the monthly midpoint pivot, the monthly M5 is here, but say the yearly midpoint pivot, the YM3 was all the way down here. Well, that's too far, because by the time price hits this M5, this monthly M5, it's really far from where the yearly midpoint pivot is. And traders may be looking at only this M5 interpretation and not considering the yearly midpoint pivot interpretation, because the yearly midpoint pivot is so far below, and price had already moved far beyond that yearly midpoint pivot. So they might not be considering that yearly midpoint pivot as a potential bearish interpretation of market developments. However, in this particular trade, the YM3 is close to the M5. So the M5, the monthly M5 and the YM3 are both considered as potential bearish interpretations at the same time. Okay? So we need that proximity. So what I typically do is I look at the distance, typically I use my eye to sort of gauge if they're close together, right? But an objective measure I feel is to sort of use the ADR as well. So at the time that I took this trade, the ADR was around 63.5. Okay, so 63.5, that's the average daily range. So the average size of one day was 63.5. And you can see here that this pip distance between the YM3 and the monthly M5 is 63.7. Okay. So what I typically do is I take this distance, which is 63.7. I take this distance between the YM3 and the monthly M5, which is 63.7, and I divide it by the ADR. So 63.7 divided by 63.5, we see that the pip distance is 1.00 times the ADR. So basically it's the same. So I consider these levels to be objectively close to each other. Therefore, I take the trade. But if the pip distance happens to be 1.3 times the ADR, that would give me pause. I'm not really sure if we should go 1.3 or maybe 1.5. I know definitely like something like 1.7 times the ADR. If the pip distance between the yearly pivot and the monthly pivot is like 1.7 ADR, I'm not interested in the trade, because by then only one of the levels is considered as an interpretation, and the other level that's 1.7 times the ADR below the level is not being considered because it's not close, right? Price has already moved on from that level. It moved up from that level, basically 1.7 ADR distance above, right? So we want to make sure that we're dealing with these monthly and yearly pivots in proximity to each other. All right. So I would say anything more than 1.3 ADR, I'm not interested in the trade, but perhaps you can make that customizable as well. Can it be that we have the customizable option of selecting it as 1.4 ADR or 1.1 ADR or something like that? Um, that's something that I felt was more reliant on your personal discretion, meaning you'd have to use your human eye coupled with the ADR to properly assess the proximity of those levels and making sure that the maximum proximity between those two levels is no more than 1.3 times the ADR. But if you could somehow write a code for that, and if that's possible, then if you could implement that as well. If not, then I guess we would just have to use the human eye for it. But if you can, then that would make the EA much more feasible. Okay. The last thing I want to discuss is Fridays. This is the New Zealand USD, right? The original rule that I had was for Fridays, right? This is the beginning of the new week, right? And this is Friday, okay? So this is a signal here, and price breaks above here. Now, we didn't get value found above the daily middle pivot, so I wouldn't have gone long here anyway. However, say we did. The rule that I put in place was we shouldn't take trades that occur, or we shouldn't enter trades in the last third of Friday, because it doesn't allow enough time for price to move to the initial target, which is the daily R1, in this case for longs, before the close of the week and the open of the new week, where new weekly pivots, meaning weekly interpretations, will plot, right? So once this new weekly interpretation plots, then it's a new interpretation, right? So price may want to move in the direction of the weekly S1, and that's exactly what it did. So if the trade was taken here, it may not have allowed enough time for price to move to this level before the open of the new week with a new interpretation, causing price to move down towards the weekly S1, thereby derailing the trade, okay, and causing it to break these lows and hitting the stop, which would be below these lows. However, when the new week opens and you have new weekly pivots plot, when we wait for price to then move towards the weekly S1, and it moves 77% of the pip distance between the weekly middle pivot and the weekly S1, then we can look for trade eligibility, right? And now you have the price hitting the YS1 as well as the monthly S3, and you have a trade opportunity here. So then you have a break here. It breaks up above the daily middle pivot, hits the H4R pivots, and then value is found in the next H4 candle for 15 minutes. And then you take the trade here, which I did right here, and then you look and see price moving in the direction of value. Okay. So this was a good trade to take because when the new weekly interpretation plotted, we waited for price to move towards that support area that acts as weekly interpretation, or more specifically, weekly bullish interpretation of historical price movement. Okay. So we got that weekly S1 bounce, and now we're able to take the trade. But taking it here on a Friday would have put us at risk and would have led to a loss because price did not have time to move to the daily R1 before new weekly pivots or new weekly interpretations plotted and derailed the trade, causing price to move down, breaking the lows and hitting where the stop loss would have been, which is below these lows. Okay. So you just don't want to get into a trade where you have the weekly interpretations working against you. Okay. If you enter the trade on a Friday and price does not have time to reach the daily R1 before new weekly pivots or new weekly interpretations plot, then we put our trade at risk because the new weekly interpretations could potentially work against the long trade. And that's what would have happened in this case. It worked against the trade and broke the lows and would have hit where the stop loss would have been had we taken the trade here. Okay. But what we did was we waited for price to drop down close to the weekly S1, thereby incorporating the weekly S1 interpretation in favor of the long trade. So this time we have the weekly interpretation working in favor of the trade instead of working against the trade. Okay. And that weekly S1 interpretation is weekly bullish interpretation, which assists in pushing price to the upside. Okay. So here's the AUD USD. And then you see here, this is a signal right here. Price hits the YM2 here, as well as the monthly S2. So these two levels are in play here. So this particular zone, right? And then hits all of the weekly S levels, hits all of the daily S levels here. So I'm looking for entry. Price pushes up, hits the H4R levels, breaks above the daily middle pivot, and then I enter here after 15-minute candle closes in the new H4 hour, right? And then you see price starts to move up, and my target is here, the daily R1. It moves up, but then it falls into this range. And as this trade is progressing, I'm saying, wow, price needs to hit this weekly R1. I'm sorry, price needs to hit this daily R1 target before the new weekly pivots plot. So before the close of the week. And I'm like, oh, it doesn't do it. It just stays here in this range. So I didn't have enough time, despite taking the trade before the last 8 hours of the Friday. I did not have the time for price to move and hit the daily R1 before the week ended. So I was basically at risk. When the new week plotted, price could have dropped down and moved towards the newly plotted weekly S1 of the new week. And luckily, price moved up first, where I was able to then drag my stop. And then I was stopped out in profit, but only a tiny bit of profit. And then you can see price kept on moving down and eventually moved towards the weekly S1. Didn't hit it, but came close. Okay. And then now the newly month plotted. So we now have to wait for price to move to the monthly S levels or the monthly R levels. So in this particular case, I think that Fridays should not be taken. Or if you do take a trade on Fridays, you're assuming that risk. Okay. So that's the issue there. If we could customize within the EA to allow the option for Fridays to not be traded, I think that would be the prudent thing to do. Okay. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So if you have any questions, just let me know. Shoot me a message on the Forex Factory. And I appreciate all that you're doing. By the way, thank you so much for all your effort. I'm glad you're well rested. And again, there's no pressure on this. There's no set time that this needs to be completed at all. I don't want to put any pressure on you. That no pressure is warranted. You can take, 50 years. I just appreciate all your effort. Thank you so much for taking this on. If you have any other questions, let me know. God bless.